south for the winter. I never stay in one country for a long time. It gets boring. I like to move on, see new places, meet different people. It's a good life, most of the time. When I need money, I get a job. I can do most things: hotel and restaurant work, building work, picking fruit. In Europe, you can pick fruit most of the year. You need to be in the right country at the right time, of course. It's not easy work, but the money's not bad. I like to go south in the winter. Life is easier in the sun, and Northern Europe can get very cold in the winter. Last year, 1989 it was, I was in Venice for October. I did some work in a hotel for 3 weeks. Then I began slowly to move south. I always go by train when I can. I like trains. You can walk about on a train, and you meet a lot of people. I left Venice and went on to Trieste. There, I got a cheap ticket for the slow train to Sofia, in Bulgaria. This train goes all down through Yugoslavia and takes a long time, a day and a half, but that didn't matter to me. The train left Trieste at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. There weren't many people on it at first, but at Zagreb more people got on. 2 girls went along the corridor, past my carriage. They looked through the door, but they didn't come in. Then an old woman came in, sat down and went to sleep. The 2 girls came back along the corridor and looked into the carriage again. The train left Zagreb, and I looked out of the window for about 10 minutes. Then I went to sleep too. When I opened my eyes again, the 2 girls were in the carriage. They looked friendly, so I said, "Hello." "Hi," they said. "You're American," I said. "Or Canadian, right?" "American," the taller girl said. She smiled. "And you're 23? Your name's Tom Walsh? You've got blue eyes? And your mum lives in Burnham-on-Sea, UK, right?" "How did you know all that?" I asked. The second girl laughed. "She looked at your passport. It's in your coat pocket." "Oh, right." My coat was on the seat next to me. I took my passport out of my pocket and put it back in my bag. "Who are you then?" I asked. They told me. Melanie and Carol from Los Angeles, USA. They liked Europe, they said. They knew a lot of places: Britain, Holland, Denmark, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Greece. "I'm going to Bulgaria now," I said, "for about a month. Then I'm going south for the winter. Cyprus, or perhaps North Africa." "Oh yes," they said. "We'll love Bulgaria. Sofia's a great town, wonderful." "What do you do about money?" I asked. "Well, you know," Carol smiled. "Sometimes we get a little job, this and that. But what about you?" "Yeah, come on," Melanie said. Tell us about you, Tom Walsh with the blue eyes and the mum in Burnham-on-Sea. What are you doing with your life, hey?" So I told them. They were nice girls. They were older than me, perhaps 27 or 28, but I liked them. We talked and laughed for hours. I told them a lot of stories about my life. Some of the stories were true, some weren't. But the girls laughed and said I was a great guy. I asked them about Bulgaria, because I didn't know the country. They knew Sofia well, they said. "Hey, Carol," Melanie said, "we're staying in Bela Palanca for a day or two, but let's go over to Sofia this weekend and meet Tom there. We can meet him on Saturday night at the Hotel Marmara." "Yeah, it's a good hotel," Carol told me. "Cheap, but good. What do you think, Tom?" "Great," I said. "Let's do that." The train was very slow. We got to Belgrade at 6 o'clock in the evening, and a lot of people got off. There were only me and the girls in the carriage then. The guard came and looked at our tickets and went away again. Carol looked at Melanie. "Hey, Mel," she said, "why don't you and Tom go along to the restaurant? I'm not hungry, and I want to sleep for an hour." Food's very expensive on the train," I said. "I haven't got much money just now. I'm going to get a job in Sofia." "Oh, Tom," Melanie said, "why didn't you tell us? Look, you're a nice guy, right? We're okay for money this week. We can buy you a meal." "Of course we can," Carol said. "And look, in Sofia, we can take you to the best restaurant in town. It's a great place. We love it." What could I say? I was hungry. They had money. I didn't. So Melanie and I went to the restaurant and had a meal. When we came back, Carol was still alone in the carriage. Melanie put her feet on the seat and went to sleep. At Nis, some more people got on the train, and 2 old men came into our carriage. They looked at Melanie's feet on the seat and talked in loud voices. Carol laughed, and Melanie opened her eyes and sat up. "Are we nearly there?" she asked Carol, and looked out of the window. "Yeah, about half an hour, I think." "Why are you getting off at Bela Palanca?" I asked. "What are you going to do there?" Melanie smiled. "Find a cheap hotel, meet people, take a look at the town, you know." "Just for a day or two," Carol said. "But there's nothing there." "Oh, well, you never know," Melanie laughed. "See you in Sofia, right? On Saturday night. The Hotel Marmara, okay? 8 o'clock, Carol said. "Don't forget now." "Okay, great," I said. "See you there." The train came into Bela Palanca and stopped. The 2 girls got off and stood on the platform. They smiled at me through the window. "Saturday, 8 o'clock, Melanie shouted. "Okay," I called. They couldn't hear me because of the noise in the station. They smiled again, picked up their bags and walked away. Nice girls. I'm going to have a great time in Sofia, I thought. The train left Yugoslavia and crossed into Bulgaria at 2 o'clock in the morning. Then the train stopped at some village. I don't remember the name. I ate an apple and looked out of the window. Suddenly, there were a lot of policemen on the train. Everybody in the carriage sat up and began to talk. "What's happening?" I said in Italian to the old man next to me. "I don't know," he said in bad Italian. "Perhaps they're looking for somebody. Look, the police are taking some people off the train." Then 2 policemen came into our carriage, a tall, thin one and a short, fat one. They looked at everybody carefully, and then they looked at me again. "Come with us, please," the fat policeman said in English. "What, me?" I said. "Why? What's the matter?" "And bring your bag with you," the tall policeman said. I began to ask a question, but policemen never like questions from young men with long hair. So I stayed quiet, picked up my bag, and went with them. In the station building, there were a lot more policemen and some people from the train. They were all young people, I saw. Some were afraid, some were bored. The police looked in everybody's bags, and then the people went back to the train. My 2 policemen took me to a table. "Your passport, please," the fat policeman said, "and open your bag." They looked at my passport, and I opened my bag. There was a young policewoman with red hair at the next table. She had a nice face, so I smiled at her, and she smiled back. "Aha!" the tall policeman said suddenly. All my dirty shirts and clothes were out on the table. The policeman picked up my bag and turned it over. Onto the table, out of my bag, fell packet after packet of US American dollars. Nice new dollars. $50 notes in big packets. A lot of money. My mouth opened and stayed open. I couldn't find my voice. I was suddenly a very interesting person, and a lot of police ran up to our table and stood behind me. 50,000, 100,000, 150,000. There's $200,000 here, the tall policeman said. "What an interesting bag, Mr. Tom Walsh." I found my voice again quickly. "But it's not my bag," I shouted. There was a big, happy smile on that policeman's face. "Well," he said, "it's got your name on it. Look." So I looked, and of course there was my name. And yes, of course, it was my bag. So how did $200,000 US get into my bag? "You cannot bring US dollars into this country," the fat policeman said. He had very short grey hair and little black eyes. He didn't smile once. "But I didn't bring them," I said quickly. "They're not my dollars. I never saw them before in my life, and—" There was a lot of noise in the station. I looked out of the window and saw my train. Slowly, it began to move. "Hey!" I shouted. "That's my train!" The tall policeman laughed. It was a great day for him. "Oh no," he said. "You're not getting back on that train. You're staying here with us, in our beautiful country." He smiled happily. So, I never got to Sofia on Saturday. I was very unhappy about that. I wanted to have a little talk with Melanie and Carol. Ask them 1 or 2 questions, you know. "You're a nice guy, Tom. See you in Sofia, okay? Take you to the best restaurant in town. Yeah, great." And I never got down to Cyprus or North Africa that winter. Oh well, I live and learn. It's not an easy life in prison, but it's warm in winter, and the food's not bad. And I'm meeting some interesting people. There's a man from Georgia, USSR. Boris, his name is. He comes from a place by the Black Sea. He's a great guy. When we get out of here, he and I are going down to Australia. Brisbane, perhaps, or Sydney. Get a job on a ship. Start a new life. Yeah, next year's going to be okay.
The Adventure of My Aunt by Washington Irving. My aunt was a big woman, very tall, with a strong mind and will. She was what you may call a very manly woman. My uncle was a thin, small man, very weak, with no will at all. He was no match for my aunt. From the day of their marriage, he began to grow smaller and weaker. His wife's powerful mind was too much for him. It undermined his health, and very soon he fell ill. My aunt took all possible care of him. Half the doctors in town visited him and prescribed medicine for him, enough to cure a whole hospital. She made him take all the medicines prescribed by the doctors, but all was in vain. My uncle grew worse and worse, and one day she found him dead. My aunt was very much upset by the death of her poor dear husband. Perhaps now she was sorry that she had made him take so much medicine, and felt perhaps that he was the victim of her kindness. Anyhow, she did all that a widow could do to honor his memory. She spent very much money on her mourning dress. She wore a miniature of him about her neck, as large as a small clock, and she had a full-length portrait of him always hanging in her bedroom. All the world praised her conduct. A woman who did so much to honor the memory of one husband deserves soon to get another, said my aunt's friends. Some time passed, and my aunt decided to move to Derbyshire, where she had a big country house. The house stood in a lonely, wild part of the country, among the grey Derbyshire hills. The servants, most of whom came with my aunt from town, did not like the sad-looking old place. They were afraid to walk alone about its half-empty, black-looking rooms. My aunt herself seemed to be struck with the lonely appearance of her house. Before she went to bed, therefore, she herself examined the doors and the windows and locked them with her own hands. Then she carried the keys from the house, together with a little box of money and jewels, to her own room. She always saw to all things herself. One evening, after she had sent away her maid, she sat by her toilet table arranging her hair. For in spite of her sorrow for my uncle, she still cared very much about her appearance. She sat for a little while, looking at her face in the glass, first on one side, then on the other. As she looked, she thought of her old friend, a rich gentleman of the neighborhood, who had visited her that day and whom she had known since her girlhood. All of a sudden, she thought she heard something move behind her. She looked round quickly, but there was nothing to be seen. Nothing but the painted portrait of her poor dear husband on the wall behind her. She gave a heavy sigh to his memory, as she always did whenever she spoke of him in company, and went on arranging her hair. Her sigh was re-echoed. She looked round again, but no one was to be seen. "Oh, it is only the wind," she thought, and went on putting her hair in papers. But her eyes were still fixed on her own reflection and the reflection of her husband's portrait in the looking-glass. Suddenly it seemed to her that in the glass she saw one of the eyes of the portrait move. It gave her a shock. "I must make sure," she thought, and moved the candle so that the light fell on the eye in the glass. Now she was sure that it moved. But not only that, it seemed to give her a wink, exactly as her husband used to do when he was living. Now my aunt got really frightened. Her heart began to beat fast. She suddenly remembered all the frightful stories about the ghosts and criminals that she had heard. But her fear soon was over. Next moment, my aunt, who, as I have said, had a remarkably strong will, became calm. She went on arranging her hair. She even sang her favorite song in a low voice, and did not make a single false note. She again moved the candle, and while moving it, she overturned her work-box. Then she took the candle and began, without any hurry, to pick up the articles one by one from the floor. She picked up something near the door, then opened the door, looked for a moment into the corridor as if in doubt whether to go, and then walked quietly out. She hurried down the stairs and ordered the servants to arm themselves with anything they could find. She herself caught up a red-hot poker and, followed by her frightened servants, returned almost at once. They entered the room. All was still and exactly in the same order as when she had left it. They approached the portrait of my uncle. "Pull down that picture," ordered my aunt. A heavy sigh was heard from the portrait. The servants stepped back in fear. "Pull it down at once," cried my aunt impatiently. The picture was pulled down, and from a hiding place behind it, they dragged out a big black-bearded fellow with a knife as long as my arm, but trembling with fear from head to foot. He confessed that he had stolen into my aunt's room to get her box of money and jewels when all the house was asleep. He had once been a servant in the house, and before my aunt's arrival had helped to put the house in order. He had noticed the hiding place when the portrait had been put up. In order to see what was going on in the room, he had made a hole in one of the eyes of the portrait. My aunt did not send for the police. She could do very well without them. She liked to take the law into her own hands. She had her own ideas of cleanliness also. She ordered the servants to draw the man through the horse pond in order to wash away his crimes, and then to dry him well with a wooden towel. But though my aunt was a very brave woman, this adventure was too much even for her. She often used to say, "It is most unpleasant for a woman to live alone in the country." Soon after, she gave her hand to the rich gentleman of the neighborhood.
The Blue Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Read by Vincenzo Nicoli. The man who got off the boat at Harwich had a short black beard. There was nothing to show that he had a gun in his coat pocket, and nothing to show that he was one of the cleverest men in Europe. He was Valentin, the chief of the Paris police and the most famous detective in the world. He was coming from Brussels to London to make the most important arrest of the century. Flambeau was in England, and the police of 3 counties were trying to catch this famous thief. In London, there was a big meeting of priests from all over the world, and Valentin was guessing that Flambeau would use this meeting for some criminal plan or other. Flambeau was strong and clever, and he enjoyed a joke. Once, he ran down the Rue de Rivoli with a policeman under one arm. But how was Valentin to find Flambeau? There was one thing to help him. Flambeau could put on other clothes or change the way he looked, but he was a very tall man and could not hide it. Because of this, Valentin was sure that Flambeau was not on the boat. He was also sure that Flambeau did not get on the train going from Harwich to London. Only 6 other people got on during the journey. 1 short railwayman, 3 short farmers, 1 very short woman, and a very short priest going up to London from an Essex village. When Valentin saw this last person, he almost laughed. The little priest had a round, simple face. He had several parcels which he found difficult to keep together, and a large umbrella which often fell to the floor. Many priests would be coming to London that day, Valentin thought, coming from their quiet little towns and villages. This one was explaining to everyone that he must be careful because he was carrying something made of real silver with blue stones in one of the parcels. He got off the train at Stratford in East London with all his parcels and came back for his umbrella. When he did, Valentin warned him not to tell everyone about his silver with blue stones. The detective was looking for people who were at least 2 meters tall, because Flambeau was several centimeters taller than this. He got off the train in central London and went to the London police to ask for help if he needed it. Then he went for a long walk. He stopped suddenly in a quiet square. On one side, the buildings were higher than the rest, and there was a small restaurant between the tall houses. It stood high above the street, with steps going up to the front door. Valentin stood looking at it, smoking a cigarette. When he was looking for a criminal, if he had a clue, he followed it. If he had no clue at all, he followed his own feelings. A man must begin somewhere, and something about the quiet little restaurant made Valentin want to start there. He went up the steps, sat down by the window, and asked for a cup of coffee. A few minutes later, Valentin was lifting the cup to his lips, but he put it down quickly. "I've put salt in it," he said, and he looked at the bowl of silvery powder It was a sugar bowl. So why did they keep salt in it? There were 2 full salt cellars on his table. What was in them? He tasted it. It was sugar. He looked around. Except for 1 or 2 dark wet stains on the white wall, there was nothing at all strange in that place. Valentin called the waiter and asked him to taste the sugar. The waiter was half asleep, but he woke up when he tasted the sugar. "Do you play this joke on your customers every morning?" asked Valentin. The waiter did not know what to say. Then suddenly he said, "It was the 2 priests." "What 2 priests?" said Valentin. "The 2 priests who threw soup at the wall over there," replied the waiter. Valentin looked again at the dark, wet stains. "The 2 of them came in and drank soup here very early this morning," the waiter explained. "They were both very quiet. One of them paid the bill and went out. The other took several more minutes to get his things together. Then he picked up his cup, which was only half empty, and threw it at the wall. I was in the back room, but I ran out to find the restaurant empty. I tried to catch them in the street, but they were too far away. They went round the corner into Carstairs Street." The detective jumped to his feet, put on his hat, and paid his bill. A moment later, he was outside. He walked round into the next street. Although he was excited and in a hurry, Valentin saw something in the front of a shop that made him stop. The shop sold fruit, and there were some oranges and some nuts at the front. They each had cards with writing on them. The card on the nuts said, "Best oranges, 2 for a penny." The card on the oranges said, "Best nuts, 4 pence for a bag." Valentin looked at the 2 cards. "I've seen this kind of joke before," he thought. He told the man in the shop about the cards. The man said nothing, but he put the cards in the right places. "Can I ask you a question?" said Valentin. "If 2 cards in a shop are in the wrong places, how are they like a priest's hat that has come to London for a holiday? Or, why do nuts that are said to be oranges make me think of 2 priests, one tall and the other short?" The man in the shop looked angry. "Are you a friend of theirs?" he said. "If you are, you can tell them that I'll bang their stupid heads together if they knock over my apples again." "Did they knock over your apples?" asked the detective. "One of them did," said the man. "Which way did they go?" asked Valentin. "Up that second road on the left-hand side, and then across the square," answered the man. "Thanks," said Valentin, and hurried away. On the other side of the second square, he found a policeman. "Have you seen 2 priests?" he asked. The policeman laughed. "I have, sir. One of them stood in the middle of the road, dropping parcels everywhere." "Which way did they go?" asked Valentin. "They went on one of those yellow buses over there," answered the policeman. "Those that go to Hampstead." Valentin told the policeman who he was, then said, "Call 2 of your men to come with me." In 2 minutes, an inspector and another detective arrived. "Well, sir," began the inspector, "how—" "I'll tell you at the top of that bus," said Valentin. When the 3 of them were sitting on the top seats, the inspector said, "A taxi is quicker." "True," said Valentin, "but we don't know where we're going. All we can do is look for some strange thing." "What kind of strange thing?" asked the inspector. "Any kind of strange thing," replied Valentin. The yellow bus went slowly up the road to the north of the city. The French detective became quiet. Lunchtime came and went, and the long roads seemed to go on forever. Valentin sat silently and watched everything that went by. The 2 other detectives were almost asleep when he suddenly shouted. They quickly followed Valentin off the bus without knowing why. "Over there," said Valentin. "The place with the broken window." He was looking at a restaurant. It had a large window with a hole in the middle of the glass. "How do we know that the window has anything to do with them?" asked the inspector. Valentin became angry. "No," he said. We can't know. But don't you understand? We must either follow one wild chance or go home to bed. They followed him into the restaurant where the three of them ate a meal at a small table. Valentin looked at the little star of a broken glass, but learned nothing from it. "Your window is broken," he said, paying his bill. "Yes, sir," replied the waiter. "It was very strange how it happened." "Tell me," said Valentin. "Two of these priests came in," said the waiter. "Those foreign priests who are in the city at the moment. They had a cheap and quiet little lunch, and one of them paid for it and went out. The other was just going to follow him when I realised something. 'Wait,' I said to the one who was nearly out of the door. 'You've paid too much.' And I picked up the bill to show him, but I got a surprise." "What do you mean?" asked Valentin. "I was sure that I'd put 4 shillings on that bill," said the waiter. "But now I saw that it was 14. "Then what happened?" said Valentin. "The priest at the door said, 'That will pay for the window.' "What window?" I asked. "The one that I'm going to break," he said. And he broke the window with his umbrella. I went after him, but I wasn't quick enough. They went up Bullock Street so fast I couldn't catch them." "Bullock Street," said Valentin. And he ran up that road as quickly as the strange pair that he was following. Their journey took them through dark, narrow streets, and the inspector guessed that they would finally reach some part of Hampstead Heath. Suddenly, Valentin stopped in front of a small, brightly lit sweet shop. After a moment, he went inside and bought some chocolate. He began to ask the shopwoman a question, but she spoke first. She saw the inspector behind him and immediately said, "If you're the police and you've come about that parcel, I've already sent it off." "Parcel?" repeated Valentin. "I mean the parcel that the priest left," said the woman. "Quickly," said Valentin. "Tell us what happened." "They came in half an hour ago," said the woman. "They bought some sweets and then went off towards the heath. Then one ran back into the shop and said, 'Did I leave a parcel?' I looked around but couldn't see one. He said, 'Never mind. But if you do find it, please send it to this address.' He left the address and a shilling for me. But after he went, I looked again and found that there was a parcel. So I posted it. I can't remember the address now, but it was somewhere in Westminster." "Is Hampstead Heath near here?" asked Valentin. "Straight on for 15 minutes, said the woman. Valentin hurried out and began to run. The others followed him. The street they went through was full of evening shadows. Then they were out on the open heath, and Valentin saw the 2 black shapes that he was looking for. They were a long way away, but Valentin saw that one was smaller than the other, and that the bigger man was over 2 meters tall. He hurried on. As he got closer, he saw something surprising, but something which he had already guessed. The small man was the priest from the Harwich train, the one who had talked about his parcels. Earlier that day, Valentin had discovered that a Father Brown from Essex was bringing a very old silver cross with valuable blue jewels to show to some of the foreign priests who were meeting in London. Valentin was sure that if he was able to find out about this, then Flambeau was able to find out too. He was also sure that Flambeau planned to steal the cross. And it was not surprising that Flambeau, looking and talking like a priest, had been able to make the simple little man come to Hampstead Heath. What Valentin could not understand were the strange clues that had brought him there too. Soup on a wall, nuts called oranges, and broken windows. The detectives followed the two across the wilder part of the heath, then lost them for a few minutes. When they saw them again, the 2 priests were sitting on a seat, having a serious conversation. Valentin and his friends hid behind a tree and listened to them talking. It was then that Valentin began to wonder if he was right. The 2 men on the seat were talking calmly about the ideas of their church. Valentin could almost hear the other two detectives laughing at him. They had come all this way only to listen to the talk of two gentle old priests. Father Brown was speaking. "Look at the stars, like jewels in the sky. But even in those other worlds there must be some laws of reason and goodness." Valentin was about to move away, but the words of the tall priest stopped him. "Who can understand the mystery of the stars?" Then he added calmly, "Just give me the silver cross, will you? We're all alone here, and I could pull you to pieces easily." The small priest did not move. He continued to look up at the stars. Perhaps he had not understood, or perhaps he was too afraid to move. "Yes," said the tall priest in the same low voice. "I am Flambeau. Now give me that cross." "No," replied the other priest. Flambeau suddenly laughed. "No, you won't give it to me, you simple little priest," he said, "because I already have it in my pocket." The small man looked at him. "Are you sure?" Flambeau laughed again. "Yes, you stupid man. I knew which of your parcels contained the jewelled cross, so I made a careful copy of the parcel, and now you, my friend, have that copy parcel, and I have the jewels. It's easily done, Father Brown, easily done." Father Brown did not look worried. "Yes, very easily. I remember another man who used to copy parcels for many years," he said. "I remembered him when I began to wonder about you." "Wonder about me?" said Flambeau. "When did you begin to wonder about me? When I brought you up to the heath?" No, said Father Brown. "When we first met. I saw that little shape under the arm of your coat, where you keep your knife." "How did you know that?" cried Flambeau. "When I was a priest in Hartlepool," said Father Brown, "there were 3 men who hid their knives in the same way. So I watched you. I saw you change the parcels, and I changed them back. Then I left the right one behind." "Left it behind?" repeated Flambeau. "I went back to the sweet shop," explained Father Brown, "and asked the woman if she saw me leave a parcel. Then I gave her an address if it was found. I knew I hadn't left a parcel. But when I went away again, I did leave one. She has posted it to a friend of mine in Westminster," he went on sadly. "I learnt that from a man in Hartlepool too. He did it with handbags which he stole at railway stations. But he's a good man now. People tell priests things, you see." Flambeau pulled a parcel from his pocket and opened it. There was only paper and stones inside it. He jumped up angrily and shouted, "I don't believe you. You've got the silver cross on you, and I'm going to take it from you." "No," said Father Brown, and he stood up. "You won't take it from me. First, because I really haven't got it, and second, because we are not alone. Behind that tree are 2 strong policemen and the cleverest detective alive. How did they come here? I'll tell you. I wasn't sure if you were a thief, so I tried several things. A man usually says if he finds salt in his coffee. If he doesn't, he has a reason for keeping quiet. I changed the salt and sugar, and you kept quiet. A man usually says if his bill is too big. If he doesn't, he has a reason for saying nothing. I changed your bill, and you paid it." Flambeau did not seem to be able to move. "I wanted to be sure the police could follow us," Father Brown went on. "At every place we went to, I did something which people would talk about. Only little things, a soup stain on a wall, some apples that were knocked over, a broken window. But I saved the cross." "How do you know all these things?" cried Flambeau. The shadow of a smile went across the round face of Father Brown. "By being a simple little priest, I suppose," he said. "If you listen to enough men telling you about their crimes, you're sure to learn something." The three policemen moved out from behind the tree. Flambeau knew when he had lost a battle, and he was famous for his politeness. He took off his hat to Valentin and smiled. "Do not take your hat off to me, my friend," said Valentin. "Let us both take them off to Father Brown." And they both stood there with their hats off, while the little Essex priest looked around for his umbrella.
The Charm. "He's a brave man," people say about me. "He's never afraid." They are wrong. I wasn't always a brave man, and at times I was afraid, very afraid. I am an important man now. I have an important job. People know me and like me. They don't know that I wasn't always brave. I will tell you the story. I was a very shy young man. I didn't like talking to other young men. I was afraid. They'll laugh at me, I thought. Women were worse. I never spoke to them. I was always afraid of them. I try to help shy people now. I never laugh at them, because I remember that time. I was very unhappy then. Then there was a war between my country and another country. I had to be a soldier. Me! I was always afraid, but I had to be a soldier. And it was very dangerous. I was afraid. The other soldiers didn't talk about it, but they knew. They're laughing at me, I thought. They aren't afraid. I was wrong, but I didn't know that. I felt very bad. One day, I was in the town. I had 2 days' holiday away from the other soldiers. I wasn't with friends. I didn't have any friends. I was very unhappy. I walked slowly past some shops. An old man stood by the road. There weren't many cars on it. Why doesn't he walk across the road? I thought. Is he afraid? I went near him, and then I saw his eyes. Oh, I thought. Now I know. He can't see. He wants to go across, but he can't go without help. Other people walked quickly past him. They had to go to work or to their homes. They didn't help him. They didn't have time. But I had time, a lot of time. I'm not doing anything, I thought. Why can't I help him? I won't be afraid of him. I took the old man's arm, and I helped him across the road. "Thank you," he said. His hand felt my coat. "This is a soldier's coat," he said. "Are you a soldier?" "Yes." Perhaps I said it in a sad voice. The old man put a hand in his jacket. He took something out and gave it to me. "Take this," he said. "It will help you. Wear it, and you'll be all right. Nothing bad will happen to you." He walked away, and I looked at the thing in my hand. It was a small charm. Pretty, but strange. It's a girl's thing, I thought, and I put it in my coat. The next day, we went to war. I was afraid, very afraid, but I remembered the charm in my coat. Perhaps the charm will help me, I thought. So I took it with me. Suddenly, I wasn't afraid. Why? I didn't know. Was it the charm? It was bad that day. Men died all round me. Perhaps I'll die next, I thought. But I wasn't afraid. Our leader was a brave man. He was in front of us, and we followed him. Suddenly, he was down. He fell to the ground and didn't move. The other soldiers stopped. They were afraid. I thought, perhaps our leader isn't dead. I'll go and see. I went to him. The fighting was worse now, but I wasn't afraid. I've got the charm with me, I thought. I'll be all right. I brought our leader back to a better place, and then I looked at him. He was very white and ill, but he wasn't dead. His eyes opened, and he smiled at me. He spoke, not easily, but I heard him. "Go in front," he said. "The men will follow you." The men followed me, and we fought well that day. After that, I was fine. Later, I was a leader too. The men were happy and followed me. People didn't laugh at me then. But is it right? I thought. I'm not very brave. It's only the charm. I didn't tell people about the charm. I had friends for the first time, and I was happy. One day, we had to take an important bridge. There were a lot of soldiers on it, and they had big guns. The country was open, without any trees. It was very dangerous, and my men were afraid. "We're going to die," they said. "Listen," I told them. "I'll go first, and we'll run very quickly to the bridge. Don't be afraid. They can't kill us all. Follow me, and we'll take that bridge." I put my hand in my coat, but the charm wasn't there. What am I going to do? I thought. I can't be brave without the charm. I looked at the faces of my men. They weren't afraid now. I thought, my words have helped them. They aren't afraid now. They're waiting for me. They'll follow me everywhere. I'm their leader, and I can't be afraid. I shouted, "Let's go!" We ran. We got to the bridge. We lost some men, but we got there, and we took the bridge. I will never forget that day. I learnt something then about brave men. Brave men are afraid too, but that doesn't stop them. I will also remember that old man with the charm. "It will help you," he said. He was right. I learnt to be brave without it. I was a young man then, and now I am old. I am a brave man, people think. And, yes, they are right. I am.
Jeff Peters and Andy Tucker could never be trusted. One day, the two men decided to open a marriage business to make some quick and easy money. The first thing they did was to write an advertisement to be published in newspapers. Their advertisement read like this: "A charming widow, beautiful and home-loving, would like to remarry. She is only 32 years old. She has $3,000 in cash and owns valuable property in the country. She would like a poor man with a loving heart. No objection to an older man or to one who is not good-looking. But he needs to be faithful and true, can take care of property, and invest money with good judgment. Give address with details about yourself. Signed, Lonely, care of Peters and Tucker, agents, Cairo, Illinois. When they finished writing the ad, Jeff Peters said to Andy Tucker, "So far, so good. And now, where is the lady?" Andy gave Jeff an unhappy look. "What does a marriage advertisement have to do with a lady?" he asked. "Now listen," Jeff answered. "You know my rule, Andy. In all illegal activities, we must obey the law in every detail. Something offered for sale must exist. It must be seen. You must be able to produce it. That is how I have kept out of trouble with the police. Now, for this business to work, we must be able to produce a charming widow, with or without the beauty, as advertised." "Well," said Andy, after thinking it over, "it might be better if the United States Post Office should decide to investigate our marriage agency. But where can you hope to find a widow who would waste her time on a marriage proposal that has no marriage in it?" Jeff said that he knew just such a woman. "An old friend of mine, Zeke Trotter," he said, "used to work in a tent show. He made his wife a widow by drinking too much of the wrong kind of alcohol. I used to stop at their house often. I think we can get her to work with us." Mrs. Zeke Trotter lived in a small town not far away. Jeff Peters went out to see her. She was not beautiful and not so young, but she seemed all right to Jeff. "Is this an honest deal you're putting on, Mr. Peters?" she asked when he told her what he wanted. "Mrs. Trotter," said Jeff, 3,000 men will seek to marry you to get your money and property. What are they prepared to give in exchange? Nothing. Nothing but the bones of a lazy, dishonest, good-for-nothing fortune-seeker. We will teach them something. This will be a great moral campaign. Does that satisfy you?" "It does, Mr. Peters," she said. "But what will my duties be? Do I have to personally reject these 3,000 good-for-nothings you speak of? Or can I throw them out in bunches?" Jeff explained that her job would be easy. She would live in a quiet hotel and have no work to do. He and Andy would take care of all letters and the business end of the plot. But he warned her that some of the men might come to see her in person. Then she would have to meet them face to face and reject them. She would be paid $25 a week and hotel costs. "Give me 5 minutes to get ready," Mrs. Trotter said. "Then you can start paying me." So Jeff took her to the city and put her in a hotel far enough from Jeff and Andy's place to cause no suspicion. Jeff Peters and Andy Tucker were now ready to catch a few fish on the hook. They placed their advertisement in newspapers across the country. They put $2,000 in a bank in Mrs. Trotter's name. They gave her the bank book to show if anyone questioned the honesty of their marriage agency. They were sure that Mrs. Trotter could be trusted and that it was safe to leave the money in her name. Their ad in the newspapers started a flood of letters, more than 100 a day. Jeff and Andy worked 12 hours a day answering them. Most of the men wrote that they had lost their jobs. The world misunderstood them. But they were full of love and other good qualities. Jeff and Andy answered every letter with high praise for the writer. They asked the men to send a photograph and more details. And they told them to include $2 to cover the cost of giving the second letter to the charming widow. Almost all the men sent in the $2 requested. It seemed to be an easy business. Still, Andy and Jeff often spoke about the trouble of cutting open envelopes and taking the money out. A few of the men came in person. Jeff and Andy sent them to Mrs. Trotter, and she did the rest. Soon, Jeff and Andy were receiving about $200 a day. One day, a federal postal inspector came by. But Jeff satisfied him that they were not breaking the law. After about 3 months, Jeff and Andy had collected more than $5,000, and they decided it was time to stop. Some people were beginning to question their honesty, and Mrs. Trotter seemed to have grown tired of her job. Too many men had come to see her, and she did not like that. Jeff went to Mrs. Trotter's hotel to pay her what she was owed and to say goodbye. He also wanted her to repay the $2,000 that was put into her bank account. When Jeff walked into the room, she was crying like a child who did not want to go to school. Now, he said, "what's it all about? Somebody hurt you? Are you getting homesick?" "No, Mr. Peters," she said. "I'll tell you. You were always a good friend of my husband, Zeke. Mr. Peters, I am in love. I just love a man so hard I can't bear not to get him. He's just the kind I've always had in mind." "Then take him," said Jeff. "Does he feel the same way about you?" "He does," Mrs. Trotter answered. "But there's a problem. He is one of the men who've been coming to see me in answer to your advertisement, and he will not marry me unless I give him the $2,000. His name is William Wilkinson." Jeff felt sorry for her. He said he would be glad to let her give the $2,000 to Mr. Wilkinson so that she could be happy. But he said he had to talk to his partner about it. Jeff returned to his hotel and discussed it with Andy. "I was expecting something like this," Andy said. "You can't trust a woman to stick with you in any plan that involves her emotions." Jeff said it was a sad thing to think that they were the cause of the breaking of a woman's heart. Andy agreed with him. "I'll tell you what I'm willing to do," said Andy. "Jeff, you have always been a man of a soft and generous heart. Perhaps I've been too hard and worldly and suspicious. For once, I will meet you halfway. Go to Mrs. Trotter. Tell her to take the $2,000 out of the bank and give it to this Wilkinson fellow, and be happy." Jeff shook Andy's hand for a long time. Then he went back to Mrs. Trotter. She cried as hard for joy as she had done for sorrow. 2 days later, Jeff and Andy prepared to leave town. "Wouldn't you like to go meet Mrs. Trotter once before we leave?" Jeff asked Andy. "She'd like to express her thanks to you." "Why, I guess not," Andy said. "I think we should hurry and catch the train." Jeff was putting all the money they had received in a belt he tied around his body. Then Andy took a large amount of money out of his pocket and asked Jeff to put it together with the other money. "What's this?" Jeff asked. "It's Mrs. Trotter's $2,000, said Andy. "How do you come to have it?" Jeff asked. "Mrs. Trotter gave it to me," Andy answered. "I have been calling on her 3 nights a week for more than a month." "Then you are William Wilkinson?" Jeff asked. "I was," Andy said.
The girl with green eyes. "Of course," the man in the brown hat said. "There are good policemen and there are bad policemen, you know." "You're right," the young man said. "Yes, that's very true. Isn't it, Julie?" He looked at the young woman next to him. Julie didn't answer and looked bored. She closed her eyes. "Julie's my wife," the young man told the man in the brown hat. "She doesn't like trains. She always feels ill on trains." "Oh, yes," the man in the brown hat said. "Now, my wife, she doesn't like buses. She nearly had an accident on a bus once. It was last year. No, it wasn't. It was 2 years ago. I remember now. It was in Manchester." He told a long, boring story about his wife and a bus in Manchester. It was a hot day and the train was slow. There were 7 people in the carriage. There was the man in the brown hat, the young man and his wife Julie, a mother and 2 children, and a tall, dark man in an expensive suit. The young man's name was Bill. He had short brown hair and a happy smile. His wife Julie had long red hair and very green eyes, the colour of seawater. They were very beautiful eyes. The man in the brown hat talked and talked. He had a big red face and a loud voice. He talked to Bill because Bill liked to talk too. The man in the brown hat laughed a lot, and when he laughed, Bill laughed too. Bill liked talking and laughing with people. The 2 children were hot and bored. They didn't want to sit down. They wanted to be noisy, and run up and down the train. "Now sit down and be quiet," their mother said. She was a small woman with a tired face and a tired voice. "I don't want to sit down," the little boy said. "I'm thirsty." "Here, have an orange," his mother said. She took an orange out of her bag and gave it to him. "I want an orange too," the little girl said loudly. "All right, here you are," said her mother. "Eat it nicely now." The children ate their oranges and were quiet for a minute. Then the little boy said, "I want a drink. I'm thirsty." The tall, dark man took out his newspaper and began to read. Julie opened her eyes and looked at the back page of his newspaper. She read about the weather in Budapest and about the football in Liverpool. She wasn't interested in Budapest, and she didn't like football, but she didn't want to listen to Bill and the man in the brown hat. Talk, 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 she thought. Bill never stops talking. Then suddenly she saw the tall man's eyes over the top of his newspaper. She could not see his mouth, but there was a smile in his eyes. Quickly, she looked down at the newspaper and read about the weather in Budapest again. The train stopped at Dawlish station, and people got on and got off. There was a lot of noise. "Is this our station?" the little girl asked. She went to the window and looked out. "No, it isn't. Now sit down," her mother said. "We're going to Penzance," the little girl told Bill, "for our holidays." "Yes," her mother said. "My sister's got a little hotel by the sea. We're staying there. It's cheap, you see." "Yes," the man in the brown hat said. "It's a nice town. I know a man there. He's got a restaurant in King Street. A lot of holiday people go there. He makes a lot of money in the summer." He laughed loudly. "Yes," he said again. "You can have a nice holiday in Penzance." "We're going to St. Austell," Bill said. "Me and Julie. It's our first holiday. Julie wanted to go to Spain, but I like St. Austell. I always go there for my holidays. It's nice in August. You can have a good time there too." Julie looked out of the window. "Where is Budapest?" she thought. "I want to go there. I want to go to Vienna, to Paris, to Rome, to Athens." Her green eyes were bored and angry. Through the window, she watched the little villages and hills of England. The man in the brown hat looked at Julie. "You're right," he said to Bill. "You can have a good time on holiday in England. We always go to Brighton, me and the wife. But the weather... We went one year and it rained every day. Morning, afternoon and night. It's true, it never stopped raining." He laughed loudly. "We nearly went home after the first week." Bill laughed too. "What did you do all day then?" he asked. Julie read about the weather in Budapest for the third time. Then she looked at the tall man's hands. They were long, brown hands, very clean. Nice hands, she thought. He wore a very expensive Japanese watch. Japan, she thought. I'd like to go to Japan. She looked up and saw the man's eyes again over the top of his newspaper. This time she did not look away. Green eyes looked into dark brown eyes for a long, slow minute. After Newton Abbot Station, the guard came into the carriage to look at their tickets. "Now then," he said, "where are we all going?" "This train's late," the man in the brown hat said. 20 minutes late by my watch." 10 minutes, the guard said. "That's all." He smiled at Julie. The tall, dark man put his newspaper down, found his ticket, and gave it to the guard. The guard looked at it. "You're all right, sir," he said. "The boat doesn't leave Plymouth before 6 o'clock. You've got lots of time." The tall man smiled, put his ticket back in his pocket, and opened his newspaper again. Julie didn't look at him. A boat, she thought. He's taking a boat from Plymouth. Where's he going? She looked at him again with her long green eyes. He read his newspaper and didn't look at her, but his eyes smiled. The train stopped at Totnes Station and more people got on and off. "Everybody's going on holiday," Bill said. He laughed. "It's going to be wonderful. No work for 2 weeks. It's a nice, quiet town, St. Austell. We can stay in bed in the mornings and sit and talk in the afternoons and have a drink or two in the evenings. Eh, Julie?" He looked at his wife. "Are you all right, Julie?" "Yes, Bill," she said quietly. "I'm okay." She looked out of the window again. The train went more quickly now, and it began to rain. Bill and the man in the brown hat talked and talked. Bill told a long story about 2 men and a dog, and the man in the brown hat laughed very loudly. "That's a good story," he said. "I like that. You tell it very well. Do you know the story about—" And he told Bill a story about a Frenchman and a bicycle. Why do people laugh at these stories? Julie thought. They're so boring. But Bill liked it. Then he told a story about an old woman and a cat, and the man in the brown hat laughed again. "That's good too. I don't know. How do you remember them all?" "Because," Julie thought, "he tells them every day." "I don't understand," the little girl said suddenly. She looked at Bill. "Why did the cat die?" "Shh! Be quiet," her mother said. "Come and eat your sandwiches now." "That's all right," Bill said. "I like children." The man in the brown hat looked at the children's sandwiches. I'm hungry too," he said. "You can get sandwiches in the restaurant on this train." He looked at Bill. "Let's go down to the restaurant, eh? I need a drink too." Bill laughed. "You're right. It's thirsty work telling stories. The two men stood up and left the carriage. The little girl ate her sandwich and looked at Julie. "But why did the cat die?" she asked. "I don't know," Julie said. "Perhaps it wanted to die." The little girl came and sat next to Julie. "I like your hair," she said. "It's beautiful." Julie looked down at her and smiled. For some minutes it was quiet in the carriage. Then the tall, dark man opened his bag and took out a book. He put it on the seat next to him and looked at Julie with a smile. Julie looked back at him and then down at the book. "Famous towns of Italy," she read. "Venice, Florence, Rome, Naples." She looked away again, out of the window at the rain. 2 weeks in St. Austell, she thought, with Bill, in the rain. After half an hour, the two men came back to the carriage. "There are a lot of people on this train," Bill said. "Do you want a sandwich, Julie?" "No," she said. "I'm not hungry. You eat them." The train was nearly at Plymouth. Doors opened and people began to move. "A lot of people get on here," the man in the brown hat said. The tall, dark man stood up and put his book and his newspaper in his bag. Then he picked up his bag and left the carriage. The train stopped at the station. A lot of people got on the train, and 2 women and an old man came into the carriage. They had a lot of bags with them. Bill and the man in the brown hat stood up and helped them. One of the women had a big bag of apples. The bag broke, and the apples went all over the carriage. "Oh, damn!" she said. Everybody laughed and helped her to find the apples. The train moved away from Plymouth Station. After a minute or two, everybody sat down, and the woman gave some apples to the children. "Where's Julie?" Bill said suddenly. "She's not here." "Perhaps she went to the restaurant," the man in the brown hat said. "But she wasn't hungry," Bill said. "She told me." The little girl looked at Bill. "She got off the train at Plymouth," she said, "with the tall dark man. I saw them." "Of course she didn't," Bill said. "She's on this train. She didn't get off." "Yes, she did," the children's mother said suddenly. "I saw her too. The tall man waited for her on the platform." "He waited for her?" Bill's mouth was open. But he read his newspaper all the time. He didn't talk to Julie, and she never talked to him. They didn't say a word." "People don't always need words, young man," the children's mother said. "But she's my wife!" Bill's face was red and angry. "She can't do that," he said loudly. He stood up. "I'm going to stop the train." Everybody looked at him, and the 2 children laughed. "No," the man in the brown hat said. "No, you don't want to do that. Sit down and eat your sandwiches, my friend." "But I don't understand. Why did she go? What am I going to do?" Bill's face was very unhappy. After a second or two, he sat down again. "What am I going to do?" he said again. "Nothing," the man in the brown hat said. He ate his sandwich slowly. "Go and have your holiday in St. Austell. You can have a good time there. Forget about Julie. Those green eyes now." He took out a second sandwich and began to eat it. "I knew a woman once with green eyes. She gave me a very bad time. No, you want to forget about Julie."
The Man Who Cut Off My Hair by Richard Marsh. Read by Jenny Funnell. My name is Judith Lee, and I am a teacher. I teach people who are deaf and dumb, and I teach them by lip reading. When people say a word, they all move their lips the same way, so if you watch them carefully, you know what they are saying. My father was one of the first people to teach lip reading. My mother was deaf, but she could lip read, so lip reading has always been part of my life. And because I have always been able to do it, I was able to play a part in the adventure I am going to tell you about. I was 13 years old when it happened. My mother and father were visiting another country, and I was staying in a small village in a cottage which we owned. Mrs. Dixon, our servant, was staying there with me. I was returning home by train one day after a visit to some friends. There were two people sitting opposite me, a man and a woman. The woman got out at a station not far from my home. Then a man got in and sat beside the one who was already there. They seemed to know each other. They talked quietly for some minutes, and it was impossible to hear what they said. But I only had to look at their faces. I was reading a magazine and looked up to see the first man say something which surprised me. "Myrtle Cottage. It's got a large myrtle tree in the front garden." The other man said something in a low voice, but his face was turned away from me. The first man replied, and I read his lips again. "His name is Colgate, and he uses it as a summer cottage. He's got some of the best old silver in England." The other man shook his head and turned so I could see his face. I saw him say, "Old silver is no better than new. You can only melt it." The first man's face became red. "Only melt it? Don't be stupid. I can sell old silver at good prices. And that silver in Myrtle Cottage must be worth more than £1,000. There's a silver salt cellar worth at least 100. The other man looked at me while I was watching his friend speak. He had fair hair and blue eyes. "That child is watching us," he whispered. "Be careful." The look in those blue eyes began to frighten me. The first man said, "Let her watch. She can't hear us." I was alone with them, and I was quite small. So I looked back at my magazine instead of watching the rest of their conversation. I knew Myrtle Cottage because it was not very far from our own cottage. And I knew Mr. Colgate, and about his old silver. I knew the silver salt cellar the two men spoke about, and wondered why they were interested in it. I was very young, I did not think, these two men who speak in whispers may not be honest. They both got out at the station before our village. After tea that evening, I went for a walk without telling Mrs. Dixon. My walk took me past Myrtle Cottage. It was small, and there were no other houses near it. I knew that Mr. Colgate was away, but when I went into the garden, I saw that the front room window was open. I looked inside. What I saw surprised me very much. In the room was the first man from the train. All of Mr. Colgate's silver was on the table in front of him, and he was holding the silver salt cellar. I did not know what to think. What was he doing there? What should I do? I was still trying to decide when a hand went round my throat. "If you make a sound, I'll kill you," said a man's voice in my ear. "Believe me, I will." It was the other man, and he recognized me. "It's the girl from the train," he said. The first man came to the window. "What's happening?" he asked. "Who's that child you're holding?" The other man pushed my face forwards. "Can't you see? I knew she was listening." "She couldn't hear us on the train," said the first man. "Nobody could hear our whispers. Give her to me." I was passed through the window, and now it was his hands that went round my throat. "Who are you?" he wanted to know. "If you scream, I'll pull your head right off you." I did not move or speak. "Cut her throat," said the other man, and took a long, terrible-looking knife with a silver handle from the table. "Wait," said his friend. He took a piece of rope from his bag. Then he pushed me into a chair and tied the rope around my arms and legs. They also tied something across my mouth to stop me speaking. The man with the blue eyes moved towards me with the knife. I was sure he was going to cut my throat. But he took my long hair in one hand, and with that terrible knife, he cut all of it from my head. I was more angry than I thought possible. I wanted to take that knife and push it into him. My long hair was more valuable to me than almost anything. Not because of my own love of it, but because my mother loved it. It pleased her so much, and she often told me how beautiful it was. And now this man had robbed me of it in the most terrible way. At that moment, I wanted to kill him. He hit me across the face with my own hair. "It didn't take me long to cut it off," he said, "but I'll cut your throat quicker if you try to move." The first man said, "Leave her alone. She can't move, and she can't make a sound. Come over here and help me." The man with blue eyes let my hair fall all over me. Then the two of them began to put Mr. Colgate's silver into 2 large bags. That was when I realized they were stealing it, and there was nothing I could do. The man with blue eyes moved towards the window, carrying one of the bags. The first man put a hand on his arm, and I watched him whisper, "Do you remember the plan?" The man with blue eyes put his mouth close to the other man's ear. I watched his lips as he said, "Cotterill, Cloakroom, Victoria Station, Brighton Railway." I knew the words were important and promised myself that I would not forget them. He got out of the window, and his bag was passed to him. He turned towards me and said, "Sorry I can't take a piece of your hair. Perhaps I'll come back for some later." Then he went, and anger burned inside me. His friend did not look at me. He took his bag and went out through the door. I don't know what happened to him afterwards. I was left alone all through that night. I was not afraid, but the rope hurt my arms and legs. I repeated the words: Cotterill, Cloakroom, Victoria Station, Brighton Railway. I was sure they were important. I did not sleep that night. Day came, and I wondered what Mrs. Dixon was doing. Was she looking for me? I had some friends who lived 3 or 4 miles away. Sometimes I stayed the night with them, without telling anyone at home. Did Mrs. Dixon think I was with them? I do not know what time it was when I heard the sound of feet outside. The day seemed almost over. I watched the open window, and suddenly a face appeared. It was Mr. Colgate. "Judith," he said. "Judith Lee." He was not a young man, but he climbed in through that window as quickly as a boy. He took a knife from his pocket and cut the rope around my arms and legs. Then he uncovered my mouth, and at last I could speak. "Cotterill, Cloakroom, Victoria Station, Brighton Railway," I said. Then I fell into Mr. Colgate's arms. I knew no more until I woke up in bed, with Mrs. Dixon standing beside me. With her were Dr. Scott, Mr. Colgate, Pierce, the village policeman, and another man. I discovered later that he was a detective. I saw that I was in a room in Myrtle Cottage, and sat up in bed, and remembered everything. "He cut off my hair with the long knife," I said. My head felt strange. I asked for a mirror, then became angry again when I saw the blue-eyed man's work. Before anyone could stop me, I jumped out of bed. "Cotterill, Cloakroom, Victoria Station, Brighton Railway," I said. "Where are my clothes?" At first they thought I was crazy, but then I told them my story. "Cotterill, Cloakroom, Victoria Station, Brighton Railway," I said again. "That's where I'm going to catch the man who cut off my hair. And if we don't go quickly, we may be too late." Mr. Colgate agreed. He wanted to get his silver back as much as I wanted to find the man who cut my hair. So we went up to London on the first train that we could catch. Mr. Colgate, the detective, and an almost hairless child. We got to Victoria Station and went to the cloakroom. "Is there a parcel here in the name of Cotterill?" asked the detective. "One in the name of Cotterill was taken only half a minute ago," the cloakroom man replied. "Didn't you see him walking off with it?" He looked along the station. "There he is. Someone's going to speak to him." I saw a man carrying a parcel, and I saw the man who was going to speak to him. "It's the man who cut my hair!" I shouted, and ran towards him as fast as I could go. He looked round and saw me, and quickly realised who I was. He whispered to the man with the parcel before running away. I saw clearly what he said. "Bantock, 13 Harwood Street, near Oxford Street." Those were the words. And then he turned and ran away. Mr. Colgate and the detective were close behind me. The man with the parcel saw us, and at once he dropped the parcel and ran off. We did not catch him, or the man who cut my hair. The station was full of people coming off a train, which made it easy for both men to escape. But we got the parcel. It was not big enough to contain Mr. Colgate's silver, we realised that. But it did contain a much bigger surprise. Jewels. A London detective was sent for. He looked at the jewels and said, "These are the Duchess of Datchet's jewels. The police all over Europe are looking for them." The man from the cloakroom was with us. "That parcel has been with us for nearly a month," he said. "The person who took it out paid for 27 days. "I wish I could catch him," said the London detective. "I have a word or two that I want to say to him." "I think I know where you can find him," I said. "Bantock, 13 Harwood Street, near Oxford Street." "Who is Bantock?" the detective asked. "I don't know," I said, "but I saw the man who cut off my hair whisper those words before he ran away." "You saw him whisper them?" The London detective looked at the others. "What does she mean?" "Young lady, you were 15 metres away. How could you hear him whisper?" "I didn't say I heard him whisper," I replied. "I said I saw him. I don't need to hear to know what a person is saying." "Judith is an excellent lip reader," said Mr. Colgate. He explained, but the others found it hard to believe. "So what did you see him whisper?" asked the detective. "I'll tell you if I can come with you," I said. The detective laughed. He seemed to think that I was amusing, but I don't know why. He did not understand how angry I was about my hair. "All right," he said. "You can come. Now tell me what you saw him whisper." So I told him again, and he wrote it down. "I know Harwood Street, but I don't know Mr. Bantock," he said. "First, I'll send a message for some help. Then we'll go and visit Mr. Bantock, if there is a Mr. Bantock." The 4 of us went in a taxi, the 2 detectives, Mr. Colgate and I. After a while, the taxi stopped on the corner of a street. "This is Harwood Street," said the London detective. "We can walk the rest of the way. We don't want a taxi to stop outside the door. They may guess who we are." It was a street full of shops. The shop at number 13 sold jewels and other less valuable things. The name Bantock was over the top of the window. As we reached the shop, a taxi stopped outside it, and 5 men got out. The London detective recognised them and did not look pleased. "Now our visit won't be a surprise," he said. "Come on, let's go in quickly." And we went in, the detective first and me behind him. There were 2 young men standing close together at the other side of the shop. When they saw us, I saw one whisper, "They're detectives! Ring the alarm bell!" "He's going to ring the alarm bell!" I shouted. The men from the other taxi were also detectives. They came in quickly and held each of the 2 young men. There was a door at the end of the shop, which the London detective opened. Stairs, he said. We'll go up. You men wait here until you're wanted. I followed him up the stairs. At the top were 2 more doors. I could hear voices coming from behind one of them. The London detective went towards it. He opened the door and went in, and I was close behind him. There were several men in there, but I was only interested in one. He was standing the other side of a table. "That's the man who cut off my hair!" I cried. He seemed at first like a man who had seen a ghost, but then he said, "I wish I had cut your throat." The police caught all the thieves. They were wanted all over the world for other robberies. Mr. Colgate got his silver back. Mr. Bantock, who owned the shop, was someone who bought and sold stolen jewels. He and all the other men in that room were sent to prison. It took many years for my hair to grow long again, and it never grew as long as before. Each time I looked into a mirror, some of my anger returned. But the man who cut my hair was stupid. Before he cut it, the rope hurt me badly, and I wasn't interested in what he and his friend were doing or saying. But after he cut it, I was very angry indeed, and so I watched every move which they and their lips made.
The Sphinx Without a Secret. One afternoon I was sitting outside the Café de la Paix in Paris, watching the people passing along the street. I was wondering why some people were very poor while others were so rich. Suddenly I heard somebody call my name. I turned round and saw Lord Murchison. We had not met since we were at Oxford University together nearly 10 years before, and I was pleased to see him again. We shook hands warmly. I had liked him very much at Oxford, and we had been very good friends. He had been so handsome, so full of life, and a very honest young man. We used to say that he would be the best person in the world if he was not always so honest. But I think we really admired him for his honesty. Now, looking at him 10 years later, he seemed different. He looked anxious and worried, and he seemed to have doubts about something. I could not believe that he was in doubt about religion or politics, because he always had such definite opinions about everything. So I thought the problem must be a woman. I asked him if he was married yet. "I don't understand women well enough to marry one," he answered. "My dear Gerald," I said, "it is our job to love women, not to understand them." "I can't love anyone that I can't trust," he answered. "I think you have a mystery in your life, Gerald," I said. "Tell me about it." "Let's go for a drive," he answered. "It's too crowded here. No, not a yellow carriage. There, that dark green one will be all right." And in a few moments we were driven away from the cafe. "Where shall we go to?" I said. "Oh, I don't mind," he answered. "The restaurant in the Bois de Boulogne? We can have dinner there, and you can tell me about yourself." "I want to hear about you first," I said. "Tell me about your mystery." He took a little leather case from his pocket and gave it to me. I opened it. Inside was a photograph of a woman. She was tall and beautiful, with long hair and large, secretive eyes. Her clothes looked very expensive. "What do you think of that face?" he said. "Is it an honest face?" I examined the face in the photograph carefully. It seemed to me to be the face of a woman with a secret. But I could not say if that secret was good or bad. The beauty of the face was full of mystery, and the faint smile on the lips made me think of the smile of the Egyptian Sphinx in the moonlight. Or was it the mysterious smile that you sometimes see on the face of Leonardo's painting The Mona Lisa in the Louvre in Paris? "Well," he cried impatiently, "what do you think?" "A beautiful Sphinx," I answered. "Tell me all about her." "Not now," he said. "After dinner." When we were drinking our coffee and smoking our cigarettes after dinner, I reminded him. And he told me this story. "One evening," he said, "I was walking down Bond Street in London at about 5 o'clock. There were a lot of carriages and the traffic was moving very slowly. There was a small yellow carriage on my side of the road which, for some reason or other, caught my attention. As the carriage passed, I saw the face that I showed you in the photograph earlier. It went straight to my heart. All that night I thought about the face, and all the next day. I looked for the yellow carriage in the usual places, but I couldn't find it. I began to think that the beautiful stranger was only something from a dream." About a week later, I went to have dinner with Madame de Rastail. Dinner was for 8 o'clock, but at 8:30 we were still waiting in the sitting-room. Finally, the servant threw open the door and said, "Lady Alroy." A woman entered the room. And it was the woman I was looking for, the woman in the yellow carriage. She came into the sitting-room very slowly, looking lovely in a grey dress. I was pleased and excited when Madame de Rastail asked me to take Lady Alroy in to dinner. Lady Alroy then sat next to me at the table. After we sat down, I said, quite innocently, "I think I saw you in Bond Street not long ago, Lady Alroy." She became very pale, and said to me in a low voice, "Please, don't talk so loudly. Someone may hear you." I felt unhappy about such a bad start to our conversation, and I started talking quickly about French theatre and other unimportant things. She spoke very little, always in the same low musical voice. She seemed to be afraid that someone might be listening. I fell madly in love, and I was excited by the mystery that seemed to surround her. I wanted to know more, much more, about this mysterious lady. She left very soon after dinner, and when she was going, I asked if I could visit her. She said nothing for a moment, looked round to see if anyone was near us, and then said, "Yes, tomorrow, at 5:15. I asked Madame de Rastail to tell me about her, but I learned only that her husband had died, and she lived in a beautiful house in the most expensive part of London. I left soon after that and went home. The next day, I arrived at her London house at exactly 5:15. I asked to see Lady Alroy, but I was told by a servant that she had just gone out. I went to the club, very unhappy and quite confused. After some thought, I wrote a letter. I asked her if I could try again another afternoon. I had no answer for several days, but at last I got a letter saying that I could visit her on Sunday at 4 o'clock. At the end of the letter there was a strange note. "Please don't write to me here again," it said. "I will explain when I see you." On Sunday she was at home when I visited her, and she was perfectly nice to me. But when I was leaving, she said, "If you want to write to me again, will you address your letter to Mrs. Knox, Whitaker's Library, Green Street. There are reasons why I can't receive letters in my own house." After that I saw her often. She continued to be pleasant and mysterious. I thought for a time that she might be in the power of a man, but I could not believe it. At last I decided to ask her to be my wife. I wrote to her at the library and asked her to see me the following Monday at 6 o'clock. She answered yes, and I was wonderfully happy. I was very much in love with her, you understand. Perhaps because of the mystery surrounding her. No, that's not right. I loved the woman. The mystery worried me, it's true. It made me angry. "So you discovered the answer to the mystery?" I cried. "In a way," he answered. "On Monday, I had lunch with my uncle in his house in Regent's Park. After lunch, I wanted some exercise, and I decided to walk to Piccadilly. The shortest way is through a lot of poor little streets. I was going along one of these when I suddenly saw Lady Alroy in front of me. Her face was half hidden by a large hat, but there was no doubt in my mind. She was walking fast. When she came to the last house in the street, she went up the steps to the front door, took a key from her bag, unlocked the door, and went in. So this is the mystery, I said to myself, and I hurried to the front of the house. It seemed to be a place where people can rent rooms. She had dropped her handkerchief when she took the key out of her bag. It was lying on the doorstep, and I picked it up and put it in my pocket. At 6 o'clock, I went to see her, as we had arranged. She was lying on a sofa in a silver-coloured dress and looked very lovely. "I'm so glad to see you," she said. "I haven't been out all day." I stared at her, very surprised. I pulled the handkerchief out of my pocket and gave it to her. "You dropped this in Cumnor Street this afternoon, Lady Alroy," I said very calmly. She looked at me in terror, but she didn't take the handkerchief. "What were you doing there?" I asked. "What right have you to question me?" she answered. "The right of a man who loves you," I said. "I came here to ask you to be my wife." She hid her face in her hands, but I could see the tears pouring from her eyes. "You must tell me," I continued. She stood up, and through her tears she looked straight into my eyes. "Lord Murchison," she said, "there is nothing to tell you." "You went to meet somebody," I cried. "This is your mystery." Her face went terribly white, and she said, "I did not go to meet anybody." "That's not true," I said. "It is true," she replied. I was mad, completely out of control. I don't know what I said, but I said terrible things to her. Finally, I rushed out of the house. She wrote me a letter the next day, but I sent it back unopened and left for Norway with my friend Alan Colville. After a month in Norway, I returned to London. When I returned, I saw in a Morning Post newspaper a report about the death of Lady Alroy. She had caught a very bad cold at the theatre one evening and had died a few days later. I shut myself in my rooms and saw nobody for days. I had loved her so much, so madly. God, I'd loved that woman. "You went to the street, to the house in it?" I said. "Yes," he answered. "One day I went to Cumnor Street. I had to go. Doubts were destroying my mind. I knocked on the door, and a woman of good appearance opened it. I asked her if she had any rooms to rent. "Well, sir," she replied politely, "the sitting-room is really taken, but I haven't seen the lady for 3 months, and the rent hasn't been paid, so I think I can let you have it." "Is this the lady?" I asked, and I showed her the photograph. "Oh, yes, that's her," she said. "When is she coming back, sir?" "The lady is dead," I replied. "Oh, dear," said the woman. "I'm very sorry to hear it. She paid me £3 a week, and she just came and sat in my sitting-room sometimes." "Did she meet someone here?" I said. "No, sir," said the woman. "Never. She always came alone, and she saw nobody." "What did she do here?" I cried. "She sat in the room, sir, reading books," answered the woman. "Sometimes she had tea, but always alone." I didn't know what to say, so I gave the woman £5 and walked home. What do you think it meant? Do you think the woman's story was true? "Yes, I do," I said. "Then why did Lady Alroy go there?" "Gerald," I answered, "Lady Alroy was simply a woman who had to have a mystery. She took the room for the pleasure of going there secretly. She imagined that she was a mysterious character in a story. She had a great love of secrets and mysteries. But she herself was just a Sphinx without a secret." "Do you really think so?" he said. "I'm sure of it," I said. He took the leather case out of his pocket, opened it, and looked at the photograph. "I'll never be sure," he said at last.
The $1,000,
$1,000.
repeated Lawyer Tolman.
And here's the money.
His voice was formal and distant. Young Gillian laughed as he touched the small package of money.
It's such an awkward amount,
he said to the lawyer.
With $10,000, you can really have fun. Even $50 are less of a problem.
You heard your uncle's will,
continued Lawyer Tolman.
Did you listen carefully? Remember that you must tell us exactly how you spend the $1,000 as soon as you spend it. It's best that you write a list for us. These were Mr. Gillian's last wishes.
Of course I will,
said the young man politely.
Perhaps I'll need a secretary to help me write the list.
Gillian put the small package of money into his coat pocket and went to his club. At his club, he looked for old Bryson, who was 40 years old and calm. He was reading a book and took off his glasses when he saw Gilliam.
Wake up, old Bryson,
said Gilliam.
I have a funny story to tell you.
Why don't you tell it to someone else?
Said old Bryson.
You know I hate your stories.
This one is better than usual,
said Gillian.
It's sad and funny. My uncle left me $1,000 in his will. Now what can a man do with $1,000?
I thought your uncle was a very rich man with about $500,000,
said old Bryson, showing very little interest.
He was,
said Gillian happily.
That's why it's so funny. He left one part of his money to the scientist who will discover a new germ, and the other part to build a hospital that will destroy the germ. Then the butler and the housekeeper got a special ring and $10 each, and I got $1,000.
You have plenty of money to spend,
said old Bryson.
Oh, yes, plenty,
said Gillian.
My uncle was very generous with me.
Are there any other heirs?
Asked old Bryson.
None, except for Miss Hayden, a ward of my uncle who lived in his house. She's a quiet girl, the daughter of one of his friends. Now, tell me, old Bryson, what can a man do with $1,000?
Old Bryson cleaned his glasses and smiled. Gillian knew that when old Bryson smiled, he was going to be very offensive.
$1,000 can be a lot of money or very little money,
he said.
A man can buy a home with it and be very happy. You can buy milk for 100 babies for 3 months and save their lives. It can give an ambitious boy an education. A man can buy a real Corot painting. You can also live well in a New Hampshire town for 2 years. But you, Bobby Gillian, can do only one thing. You can buy Miss Lotta Laurier a diamond pendant with $1,000.
Thanks,
said Gillian.
I knew you could solve the problem.
Gillian phoned for a taxi. He said to the driver,
Please take me to the Columbine Theater.
Miss Lotta Laurier was getting ready for her performance. When she saw Gillian, she said,
What is it, Bobby? I have a performance in 2 minutes.
This won't take 2 minutes. Would you like a little pendant? I can spend $1,000 on it.
Oh, all right,
said Miss Laurier.
Where is my hat? Bobby, did you see the necklace Della Stacy was wearing the other night? It cost $2,200 at Tiffany's. But, all right.
Miss Laurier, you're on stage in a minute,
cried the manager of the theater. Gillian returned to his taxi.
What can a man do with $1,000?
He asked the driver.
Open a saloon,
said the driver immediately.
I know a perfect place for a saloon where I could make lots of money and...
Please drive until I tell you to stop,
said Gillian. They drove down Broadway, and Gillian saw a blind man on the sidewalk. He was sitting on a chair and selling pencils. Gillian got out of the taxi and stood in front of him.
Excuse me,
he said,
but what can you do with $1,000?
You just got out of the taxi, didn't you?
Asked the blind man.
Yes, I did,
said Gillian.
I think you must be a gentleman if you ride a taxi during the day. Take a look at this, please.
He took a small book from his coat pocket and gave it to Gillian. Gillian opened it and saw that it was a bank deposit book. It showed a sum of $1,785. Gillian returned the bank deposit book and got into the cab.
I forgot something,
he said.
Drive to the law offices of Tolman and Sharp.
Lawyer Tolman looked at him severely through his glasses.
Excuse me,
said Gillian cheerfully.
May I ask you a question? Did my uncle leave Miss Hayden anything besides the ring and the $10?
Nothing,
said Mr. Tolman.
Thank you very much, sir,
said Gillian, and he returned to his taxi. He gave the driver the address of his late uncle's home. Miss Hayden was writing letters in the library. She was small and thin, and she wore black clothes, but she had lovely eyes. Gillian entered and said,
I was at the lawyer's office, and he found an additional clause to my uncle's will. It seems that he left you $1,000. Mr. Tolman asked me to bring you this money. Here it is. Please count it to see if it's right.
Gillian put the money near her hand on the desk. Miss Hayden's face turned white.
Oh,
She said, and again.
oh,
Gillian turned and looked out of the window.
I think you know that I love you.
Gillian said,
I am sorry.
said Miss Hayden, taking her money.
Then there is no hope?
Asked Gillian.
I am sorry.
She said again.
May I write a note?
Asked Gillian with a smile. He sat down at the big library table. She gave him some paper and a pen. Gillian wrote, Paid by Robert Gillian. $1,000 to the best and dearest woman in the world, for all the happiness she brings to people. Gillian put his note into an envelope and went away. His taxi stopped again at the law offices of Tolman and Sharp.
I spent the $1,000,
He said happily.
and I am here to tell you exactly how I spent them.
He threw the white envelope on the lawyer's table. Mr. Tolman did not touch the envelope and went to a door and called his partner, Mr. Sharp. Together, they opened the big safe. They took out a large envelope and slowly opened it.
Mr. Gillian,
Mr. Tolman said, formally.
there is a codicil to your uncle's will. He gave it to us privately. It can be opened only after you spend the $1,000. This is what it says. Dear Robert, spend the $1,000 wisely and carefully, and you will receive $50,000 in bonds. Spend the money carelessly and foolishly, as you did in the past, and the $50,000 in bonds will go to Miriam Hayden, my ward. Your uncle, Septimus Gillian. Now, Mr. Sharp and I will examine your note and then decide.
Mr. Tolman put out his hand to take the note, but Gillian was quicker. He took it and tore it into little pieces and put them in his pocket.
Oh, it's all right.
He said, smiling.
I don't want to disturb you with this. I lost the $1,000 at the horse races. Good day to you, gentlemen.
Tolman and Sharp looked at each other and shook their heads. Gillian left and whistled happily as he waited for the elevator.